Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and first and foremost, happy Mother's Day to all the moms, all the mother figures out there. We appreciate everything you do. So, hope everybody's having a great holiday day. So, we're going to talk about a couple of things today. We're going to talk for a moment about Ovidio Guzman. And then we're going to talk about a news article that came out in the last week or so that puts into a specific case things we've talked about in the past with respect to cartels and their efforts to increase their influence and money-generating sources in unique ways. So we'll talk about that. And then at the end, I want to talk about Hector Berrellez for just a moment. Before we get into that, I do want to plug myself for just a second. So my second book, Someone Had to Lie, has been out for just about 2 months now. And I'm really happy to say that over the last couple of weeks, it was officially listed as an Amazon bestseller by being in the top 100 sellers in a couple of different categories. So thank you to everybody who has purchased the book. If you'd like to get the book, it talks an awful lot about the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking, primarily starting with El Chapo, but touches on other things as well. And it's a creative nonfiction, so a fictional narrative to tell a true story. You can get it at Amazon, all those places. You can also get signed copies at llewellynwriting.com. All right, enough of that. The news on Ovidio Guzman. So Ovidio was set for a status hearing last week. A couple of days before the status hearing, a minute order was entered, which essentially said that the government had represented to the court that a plea agreement was in place or imminent. And as a result, the court struck the status hearing on the 9th. And instead scheduled an in-person plea hearing for July 9th. And the court ordered that a copy of the plea agreement be provided to the judge, and that would be the executed plea agreement between the government and the defendant, but that be provided to the judge 3 days before that hearing, or at least not less than 3 days before that hearing. So what do we make of this? Well, number one, there were a lot of people jumping up and down. Ovidio's going to, he's turning. Come on, folks. We all expected that, didn't we? Really? I mean, we've talked about the relationship of the four Chapitos. We talked about Ovidio in the past, kind of his nature, his family situation. So it is not at all surprising to me that he would take a plea bargain. I do note, however, that this is almost the exact same thing that happened with El Menchito, right? The government said, we got a plea agreement, and then they show up on that day to enter the plea, and Menchito says, nope, not going to do it, and then he gets convicted and sentenced to lots of time. So let's just say it's never done until it's done. But I got to think, that him entering a plea agreement, giving up some information makes a lot of sense for him. Query now, what information does he have to give up? And remember, we've talked a lot about this pattern, this practice that the U.S. government has of entering into plea agreements with drug traffickers and others to get kind of minimal information in a lot of cases. And to me, this may be a prime example of that. Though Ovidio's name sounds great. Oh, we got something from Ovidio. How much does he really know? How much can he really share that's going to be valuable to the government, to the U.S. government, and maybe through intelligence to the Mexican government in fighting the cartels now that he's been, in the U.S. for 2 years? Right? So I'm not surprised, but I'm also not convinced that this is another one of the proverbial death knells to Los Chapitos, death sentences for CDS. We've seen a lot of them, including Ovidio's father, right? Oh, El Chapo's captured, CDS is going to crumble. That didn't happen. Didn't happen when Ovidio himself, was captured. You got to think if he's been providing some type of information for a significant period of time. So in short, I don't think it's as big a deal as it might sound. So, all right. Second topic of the day. We've talked, as I mentioned earlier, a lot about the idea that many of the cartels are not solely engaged in drug trafficking these days. That their criminal enterprise is far more sophisticated than that and reaches into a number of different money-making ventures. So, for example, we've discussed mining in Mexico. We've discussed the fishing trade in Mexico. We've talked about the idea of, that there are parties that are responsible for or are engaged in the business of money laundering. You can talk about extortion, you can talk about kidnapping, various things. We've also talked about the fact that in Mexico, oil theft is a very big deal. Last week, a story came out that was pretty fascinating. And it shows the extent to which the cartels will go to spread their influence and, to generate wealth for them and tangentially for others. So what's the story? So a Utah family that lives just south of Salt Lake City was arrested in late April. They were indicted on federal charges in connection with a scheme to smuggle crude oil from Mexico into the United States. James Jensen and his wife, Kelly, were booked into the Salt Lake County Jail after authorities executed an arrest warrant at their $9.1 million mansion. The couple was accused of conspiring to smuggle 2,881 shipments of crude from Mexico. Interestingly enough, apparently, when the U.S. Marshals Violent Fugitive Apprehension Team showed up at their 26,893 square foot mansion in Sandy, Utah, the couple refused to come out, and the U.S. Marshals entered the residence via use of a battering ram. Okay. The illegal shipments of crude apparently started in May of 2022. An arrest warrant filed in the case says James Jensen conspired with his wife, Kelly Jensen, and two of his sons, Maxwell and Zachary, to launder proceeds from sales of illegally imported crude oil. The warrant goes on to say the payments for this crude oil were directed to businesses in Mexico that operate only through the permission of Mexican criminal organizations. James Jensen was aware that the payments he made were going to these Mexican criminal organizations. The warrant alleged that over $47 million went from businesses run by James and Kelly Jensen to these Mexican businesses. And in another document filed, this one was actually the United States' position with respect to detention. And this was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Utah. They were actually indicted in Texas, but because they lived and were arrested in Utah, the detention proceedings initially were in the District Court for Utah. But in those documents, there are these particular allegations which are similar. James Jensen is in business relationships with individuals he knows work with Mexican criminal organization. Any business that provides oil outside of Mexican government regulation are only able to get crude oil through Mexican criminal organizations. The businesses that are run by James and Kelly Jensen have suppliers located in Mexico. Over $47 million went from Jensen businesses to Mexican businesses. Dozens of people that the businesses run by James and Kelly Jensen have relationships with individuals that reside in Mexico. James and Kelly Jensen, in addition to having a, what did we say earlier, 26,893 square foot, $9.1 million mansion. The detention position from the United States government with respect to Mr. and Mrs. Jensen alleged that they have the means to support themselves through funds and other bank accounts, United States and foreign, that are not subject to seizure warrant. James and Kelly Jensen have a residence in the Bahamas and travel there on average every other month. They were there the week of April 14th. All that to try to say that that Mr. and Mrs. Jensen should not be released. We'll talk about what did happen in a second, but in case you're kind of wondering how this worked, the Jensen family apparently owned or owns and operates a crude oil trading company in Rio Hondo, Texas, which is a small community about 30 miles north of the U.S.-Mexican border around Brownsville, kind of that area. Federal agents raided their business, Arroyo Terminals, and 2 days later, the company's website was taken offline, placed under government control. As I mentioned, the prosecutors requested that James and Kelly Jensen be held without bail due to a flight risk. They both were released from federal custody, but they had GPS monitoring and they had to surrender their passports. The sons, Max and Zachary, were sent to Brownsville, Texas, or were in court in Brownsville, Texas. They were held without bond pending a detention hearing, which I believe has already occurred, but I haven't quite been able to figure out yet what the situation was for them, if they've been released on bail under similar circumstances. Coincidentally, late last week, the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 2 entities and 3 Mexican nationals it said were involved in a drug trafficking and oil smuggling network linked to CJNG. The Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 2 hazardous materials transportation companies, saying that they have transported fuel and crude oil between Mexico and the United States on behalf of individuals linked to cartels. Treasury Department alleged that the network generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually, benefiting CJNG through fentanyl trafficking, fuel theft, and smuggling stolen crude from Mexico across the southwest border. Fuel theft and crude smuggling are cash cows for CJNG's narco-terrorist enterprise, providing a lucrative revenue stream for the group and enabling it to wreak havoc in Mexico and in the United States. That, according to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He also reiterated the kind of common position of the administration that the U.S. would continue to use all available tools to target the cartels. So as I mentioned earlier, the point of this is not necessarily just to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, though it is an interesting story. I mean, think about it. If you'd said, where in the country would you least expect to find people illegally shipping and smuggling crude oil for the benefit of Mexican cartels, I'm not sure that Sandy, Utah would be high on that list. But again, it shows the extent of the reach, the influence of the cartels, and makes fighting the cartels incredibly difficult, right? If you had a cartel that all they did was ship fentanyl across the border by car at checkpoints from Mexico into the United States, that cartel would be easy to combat, right? But then you add a layer on, oh no, they don't just do fentanyl, they do other things, other drugs, okay? And you add the layer on, well, we don't just ship it by car through checkpoints, at the border, but we use all kinds of other mechanisms to get product from Mexico into the United States. All right, that makes it harder. Oh, by the way, we're also involved in a number of legitimate businesses. Okay, that makes it harder. All right, we also have our tentacles in, mining, oil, shipping, fishing, you name it. It makes it even harder, right? It's hard to combat everything. It's hard to shut off one revenue source and not have that revenue source be made up another way. So, I think everybody knows I've tried to articulate how difficult the process of combating the cartels is, both from the Mexican standpoint and a standpoint of the United States government. And these ideas that you can just send the military into Mexico and somehow you're going to be able to wipe out all of the cartels, to me, is just fanciful. It's a more difficult problem than that. It's a more complicated situation than that. That, my friends, was the reason for the story of Kelly and James Jensen of Sandy, Utah. By the way, if you want a really big mansion in Sandy, you got to think one's going to be for sale pretty soon. Okay, I wanted to go into that today because I thought it was relevant and things. I also knew it was a little bit short, and rather than leaving you, wanting more or thinking that you got shortcut, I want to talk about one other thing, and I've alluded to this over the last couple of episodes. Every so often, Hector Berrellez, retired DEA agent Hector Berrellez, former head of Operation Landa Hector Berrellez, raises his profile generally on social media, oftentimes on YouTube and other sources, often in the Mexican language. Recently, with the court appearances of Rafael Caro Quintero, Agent Berrellez has reappeared, and he's made some interesting statements. One of the things I want to reiterate, okay, whether you believe some, all, or none of what Agent Berrellez says, keep in mind he has no percipient knowledge of the events surrounding the Camarena abduction, torture, and murder. None. He was nowhere around, right? So anything he says has to be taken with that in mind. Keep in mind also that a high percentage of his allegations are not supported by any known documents, not supported by any contemporaneous statements, not supported by anyone other than the witnesses that he developed, paid, put on the stand, and allowed to stay in the United States despite their criminal record in Mexico and, in at least one case, in the United States. Okay? So keep all of that in mind whenever you're listening to him. The prime example of that is his allegation that it was the CIA, right? CIA got worried about Agent Camarena finding out that the CIA was working with the cartels and had him killed. There's not one piece of paper that I've ever seen that says anything even remotely close to corroborating that. At most, the best evidence he has is a statement from Lawrence Victor Harrison, who we've talked about before, who went through several identities and things. But again, there's no corroboration, none whatsoever. When I spoke to Agent Berrellez, and it's been probably 18 months since the last time I talked to him, he said, well, you just don't want the CIA to have been involved. I said, I'd love it. If I found the document that proved it, I'd shout it from the mountaintops. And I said, if you've got documents that prove it, bring it on. Let's see it. But you know what? He wrote a book. They're not there. But here's what I really want to say. In the last YouTube video that I saw of Agent Berrellez, he says something to the effect of, well, Caro Quintero could go on trial. Caro Quintero could testify. And if he does testify, and he does testify truthfully, then that will implicate Felix Rodriguez and Jaime Kirkendall, both of whom should be in jail. We've talked about both of those individually and together a lot. Let me be very clear. That statement from Agent Berrellez is defamatory. It's libelous. I believe it's categorically wrong, but it's improper. You should not be able to get on a YouTube program and say that this person or that person was involved in the Camarena abduction and murder and should be in jail. Especially when you've never come out with any evidence to support it. And I'll talk about Felix Rodriguez for half a second. Right? He says that he, being Agent Berrellez, says that Felix Rodriguez was involved in the interrogation of Agent Camarena. Nothing corroborates that. And again, Hector, if you're out there, you've got something that corroborates it. That's not just a statement from Rene Lopez Romero or Jorge Godoy or one of those others. If you've got something that proves it, let's see it. Show the world. I'll put you on my podcast any day. But in the meantime, I want everybody to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to assist those who have been wronged by these statements of Hector Berrellez. It's wrong. It deserves to be punished. And I'm going to do everything I can to help in that regard. Okay. I'm hopping off my soapbox now. I just really want people to have the right mindset and the right knowledge base when listening to things that are said by Agent Berrellez. And I'll reiterate, if I'm wrong, come prove it to me. Come show documents. And if I'm wrong and there's evidence, contemporaneous evidence, verifiable evidence that supports these claims, bring it on, and I'll be the first one to say I was wrong. Until then, be very, very careful about what you say. All right. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. I'm going to make this a little bit short. But everybody, have a great rest of your weekend. I'll be back next week with a new episode of Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I don't know what we're going to talk about yet, but we'll have a podcast. Have a great day and a great week, everyone.